Hello, all, and welcome to a very special episode of the Movie Bears podcast. I am delighted, as Brad Harris, your host, one of your hosts, to bring you a special episode of our show centered around something we love very dearly, that being a little TV show you may never have heard of before called Steven Universe. We talked about this on a previous episode as kind of a half joke, half serious, and you guys were like, yes, you have to do a Steven Universe special. So you know what? Here we go. We're going to do it. Before we jump into that, though, let me introduce you to my wonderful co-hosts for this very special episode. Will Lindis is here. Welcome, Will.
Hey there, movie and TV fans, and greetings from Beach City.
Greetings indeed. We're also very, very delighted to have the sexy voice of the Movie Bears podcast, Chris Lopez, join us. Welcome back, Chris. How are you?
Hey, everybody. Doing pretty good. I dusted off the mic just for this episode, so happy to be back.
Thrilled to have you back. How much dust was on that microphone, Chris?
You probably don't want to know.
Oh, goodness. Well, we're glad that you did a little bit of light/heavy dusting in order to be here with us for this episode. I want to talk a little bit because I know we have some folks who are not familiar with Steven Universe, or maybe they've just seen little bits and pieces of it, like my husband Jim, who seems to have only seen the silly stuff and none of like the heavy duty feels. So I want to talk a little bit about what this show is, kind of what it's about, the premise, and then we'll kind of unpack things spoiler free as we talk through some of our favorite aspects of the show before diving into some of our favorite episodes, at which point we'll give you a spoiler warning. So if you've not seen Steven Universe before, don't worry. You can hang around for a while. We'll let you know when might be good to step away for a little bit. But we are super excited to share our love of Steven Universe with you. Let's get started. Will Lindis, would you mind giving us a little bit of the premise treatment, some background on the show?
Yeah, absolutely. So Steven Universe is a show. It's an animated show that is on Cartoon Network. It's been airing since 2013 by showrunner Rebecca Sugar, who was a storyboard artist for shows like Adventure Time prior to spinning off onto her own program. Steven Universe itself is a show about these three magical humanoid aliens named Pearl, Garnet, and Amethyst, who serve as the crystal gems, and they are charged with protecting the Earth. With them is a young boy, 10 years old at the start of the series, named Steven Universe, who is actually a half gem himself, half human, half gem. And he goes on these adventures with the crystal gems, helps protect Earth, and sort of has his own coming of age / growth arc as the story progresses. This is a show that is all about the relationship and almost the family type bond between these four particular characters and the different people, both human and alien, that come into their lives. So that's the major background for the show. Anything you guys would want to add before? I didn't want to get into spoilery stuff, but anything to really add on that?
You know, Will, one thing that I was really curious about, because I think we've all kind of found this show at different times. What was the way that you came to the show? Did you come in right at the start? Did you come in later? Like, how did that work for you?
So I came into this sort of in two different spots. I'm a big Adventure Time fan. I love the work that Rebecca Sugar has put into that show before she left. And so when they spun off, it actually aired right after Adventure Time. So I had a recording on my DVR that had this show called Steven Universe just on the back part of it. So I watched the first episode when it first aired, but around the time I had sort of a hard rule on I wasn't going to start any new programs. We're in this weird golden era of television where there's just so much good television and so little time, and so many of these shows don't make it very long anyway. So I liked this first episode, didn't stick with it, and then somewhere around midway through season 1, so we're a good number of episodes in at this point, I look up and realize it's still on, it's still going fine, and it's starting to get people excited. And I thought, well, you know what? I liked it when I watched that first episode. let me dive back in and see what happened. So I was able to get back on board right before one of the kind of the big season 1 episodes, which I think we're going to be talking about here in a little bit, which was a really timely and interesting place for me to get back on board. And I've been on board ever since.
Nice. Chris, how about you? What has your experience been like?
So yeah, like Will, I was a pretty big Adventure Time fan, and when I heard that Rebecca Sugar was spinning off and doing her own show, I was super excited. Saw the early pilot and was just like eager to see what the show was actually going to develop into. I also heard that one of the executive producers was going to be a gentleman by the name of Ian Jones Cordy, who's also spinning off and doing his own show now. But way back when I was designing my own webcomics, he had a webcomic of his own, and so I've known him, or at least about him, I don't know him personally, for years at this point. So it was kind of cool to see him, like someone that like I used to read their webcomics for free is now doing this like amazing show. So I was super excited to get on board. Watching the shows, I started at the beginning, and the tone, I think it took a little while to find the tone of where the show eventually got to. So I kind of watched about maybe about 20 episodes. Then I was like, oh, I think I'm just going to put it down for a little while. And then little by little, I started hearing more and more buzz. And so then I picked it back up probably in about another 10 episodes, and then just, watched what I missed, which is pretty easy when the episodes are only 10 minutes long. And was on board ever since then.
Wow. So both of you guys, it sounds like, were on board the Steven Universe train pretty early then, compared to me, because I came in probably about a year and a half ago. It's funny, Chris, we were talking in the chat earlier about spoilers, and you were like, this show came out in 2013. How much spoiler warning do you need? And, for me, having come into it so recently compared to you guys, I'm kind of glad, actually, that I was able to avoid spoilers as much as I did for this show, because, man, I tell you, I love this show a lot. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why, but you guys mentioned Adventure Time. So I tried Adventure Time based partly on your recommendations and other friends' recommendations. And at least the first 15 episodes, that's as far as I got. The level of silly was just too high for me. It was just beyond my silly threshold. And then everyone's like, well, if you don't like Adventure Time very much, you should try Steven Universe, because it has the silly, but it has a lot more deep emotion, and it's happening almost right from the start. And I'm like, ugh, no, you guys already sucker punched me with Adventure Time, not doing it. And so I waited 2.5 years or whatever it was. And finally, the buzz was just so high. I was like, you know what? I'm going to sit down. I'm going to give this a 5-episode try. And by episode 2, I was completely hooked. So I binged my way. I got totally current. And then I was current, I think, just in time for the summer of Steven last year. And so have been following it ever since. And man, I'm kind of jealous that you guys got in as early as you did. I kind of wish I would have listened to the hype earlier, but the Adventure Time thing burned me a little, so I was hesitant.
So I had a question for you. Were you maybe in a different headspace or anything? Because I think the early episodes are probably the silliest as far as Steven Universe goes, and I'm wondering what about it managed to catch you where Adventure Time didn't.
Yeah, it's hard to talk to without spoiling a little bit, but sure. I would say even as early as episode 2 and 3, there's some things that Steven is going through, partly of his own making, but he gets genuinely little boy scared, and he's running to his dad and running to his friends, and he's crying and doesn't know what to do. And just, I guess, something about that, with the silliness sort of encapsulated around it, was enough to kind of hook me. Plus, I feel like I identify with, the little fat kid running around a little more than I did with Finn and Jake running around. So maybe that gave me a bit more, I don't know, a bit more of a hook to get into the show. But I mean, everyone's different. I'm not saying Adventure Time is a bad show by any means. Just it didn't grab me like Steven Universe did.
Which is totally fair. One of the things that's nice about both of those shows is they both have they have kind of a similar arc in that the first seasons or so are all about laying the groundwork and getting things going, and with amping stakes, so that I keep telling people, like, these are the types of shows that have some of the best long form narratives that I've seen on television. And these are children's programs, right? Like, these should be just kind of disposable, kind of nonsense things meant to sell toys, or at least that's what I think of when I think of kids' toys. I think of that because, Brad, we're the same age. You guys, we grew up around the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those were our cartoons growing up, right? Like, our cartoons were designed to sell us toys. I'm jealous of children today who have shows like Steven Universe, Adventure Time, Gravity Falls, like some of the best animated programs I can think of. Children are experiencing right now, and that's awe-inspiring. I love that they're getting to experience, like, less commercialism and more storytelling in their programming.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Because, yeah, as a kid, I mean, as much as I loved them, you know, He-Man and G.I. Joe and Transformers, they were all toys first, and the cartoons were developed specifically to sell them. And, you know, like I said, they were awesome, and I had a bunch of them. But looking back at them today, the story is not really great, not really memorable, mostly laughable, to be honest. So, as you know, it's kind of cool what they're doing with the, you know, some of the new shows, like revitalizing, like maybe Voltron and stuff, and giving it that storytelling overview. So, golden age of television, I think, is definitely encompasses animation as well and children's programming.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, this shift in how children's shows are made, produced, and tied in with merchandise, right? Because, you know, as someone who still loves He-Man and She-Ra, even today, that both of those shows, you know, produced by Filmation Studios, were very constrained by Mattel and what they were able to do. They had to toe a certain line. Like when a new He-Man vehicle came out, of course, it had to be in an episode and feature heavily. And I like that the studio tried to, like, go beyond just that formula, and they did some cool things. But I mean, you can really see the seams sometimes where it's like, oh, here's the tacked on thing of the week they had to do before they could get to the real story. Whereas with a show like Steven Universe, obviously there are toys, there is merchandise out there, but it feels like a storytelling mechanism first. And I never really, like, I don't know. I haven't watched it really with commercials much. Maybe they advertise Steven Universe toys in the commercials on Cartoon Network. I don't know, but I've never gotten that same sort of feeling.
Yeah, it's the marketing, the advertising is completely different. It's something that I've been sort of championing for a long time. It's why I'm such a big fan of things like some of the more mature, like Pixar type stories or animated films, that, like Inside Out, which is a film that I think handles a lot of complicated thoughts about emotions in a way that is relatable, but doesn't necessarily talk down to children. I think children are way smarter than we give them credit for. And I think we've spoon-fed children just like a bunch of garbage over the last several decades, just thinking like this is what kids want, therefore that's what they're going to get. So I respect the fact that these storytellers respect the children's intelligence, that they can follow a complicated story over multiple seasons instead of something that has to be resolved within 11 minutes because the kids won't, like, remember it. Kids will remember everything. Kids remember every dang Pokemon that has ever come out, and they can do all 700 plus start to finish. They can remember complex storylines if we just trust them and give them those complex storylines.
Definitely a fair point. You know, we've started sort of broaching this conversation already, and I think this is the perfect time to sort of take it to the next level in terms of, you know, especially for anyone out there who maybe is new to Steven Universe. Maybe they've heard about it. It looked silly. It looked dumb. They didn't really feel like giving it a chance. Maybe someone who's only seen the first couple episodes, it hasn't hooked them yet. I think it'd be great to talk spoiler-free for a little while about what aspects of the show, of course, without giving anything away for potential watchers, really draw you to it, really keep you sort of on the train, so to speak. And Chris, if you don't mind going first, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, sure. Yeah, maybe we'll just pass the baton around so I don't talk for like 3 hours straight. But yeah, like I can start with just kind of the basic premise of the show. Will had mentioned that it was primarily about the family unit of these super heroine ladies and Steven. And so on one hand, it seems pretty kind of standard, like maybe like a magical girl type anime, which and this show definitely has a lot of anime influences and isn't afraid to show them. Um, but it's definitely not an anime style cartoon. And the focus is primarily on this non-traditional family unit and the love that is shared between all of them and Steven and his mom and his dad and it manifests itself pretty evidently in a lot of episodes. In a lot of episodes, they say "I love you, Steven." They give him like a little kiss. So there's a lot of very tender moments, and the relationships grow and change and get strained and are challenged and don't get fixed at the end of 10 minutes sometimes. And sometimes they take long arcs to fix, or sometimes it takes something special for things to get better, and not necessarily the way they were, because like I said, things change and things evolve. So I think it handles this sort of love and relationships pretty and that's definitely one of the more interesting aspects of the show.
Will, how about for you, Will? Do those things that Chris just mentioned, family and love and affection, do they resonate with you? Is it kind of the same or different?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's part of the magic of this magical girl adventure, or magical young boy adventure, is that this is a story that is about family first. And the family itself is, yes, there's a biological component. One of our favorite characters is Steven's dad, Greg. But it's also about this sort of makeshift kind of patched together with like spit and strings type of a family unit that isn't perfect, isn't polished, but is there and has come together for all of the right reasons. Chris mentioned love and relationships, and I think that's one of the things that's most impressive about this program. I think that when we think about the types of storytelling that happens when it comes to telling relationships, it's always a very binary story, like, boy meets girl, girl meets boy. They fall in love. They have a rocky relationship. They get over it or they don't. That is 99% of all romantic stories that we have. I think that what Steven Universe does so wonderfully is it showcases a lot of different relationships, both romantic and familial, in a lot of very complex and nuanced ways, some ways that I have never seen on television. I've actually told people on multiple occasions, I have never seen a program that handled the spectrum of human relationships as maturely as this children's television program does.
Yeah, Chris and Will, I think you both really hit it on the head here in terms of those relationships and how they're handled. Inside Out was brought up earlier, and I think that's an absolutely phenomenal film. And I think there are some interesting parallels in terms of what they do with the emotional connections and sort of like how deep those connections go. Like when you think about like a Cartoon Network show, my first thoughts go to something like, I don't know, like Uncle Grandpa or something like super crazy silly. And I haven't really watched that show, so I can't pass judgment on it. I think the most I saw was like the April Fool's Day Steven Universe episode, where, spoiler alert, there's like a crossover. But I like that, even though on the surface maybe this show seems like it's just going to be funny, it seems like it's just going to be like another one of those shows, it really gets much, much deeper. So the relationships are a big part of it. Another reason, and Chris, I think this goes back to your question earlier about why did Steven Universe grab me and maybe Adventure Time didn't. Growing up, as a fat kid, I can relate a lot to Steven, not because I have a magical gem in my belly, but because I think I really navigated the world, and still do to some extent, with my feelings first. I'm often told I'm too sensitive and I am too emotional. And, what's interesting is, as an adult, after being told that by people, I started like toning down those things about my personality. I started trying to like, harden my exterior shell and stop wearing my heart on my sleeve. And I can honestly tell you guys, after watching this show and sort of relating to Steven, I gave myself permission to be that like emotional, enthusiastic, like navigating by feelings person again, even in a world of adults who tell you shouldn't do that. Like if I want to laugh out loud, like I will. I'm just going to be who I am. And, I would rather like talk to people about their problems and try to navigate things like through the feelings involved rather than just sort of bottle things up and shut down. And so this cartoon has not only been really entertaining to watch, I feel like it's really created some positive impacts in my personal relationships, not just with people in my own life, but also at work. I'm a corporate trainer by trade, and I'll tell you, I bust out like Steven Universe feelings talk all the time. And it's one of the reasons why, not to toot my own horn, but why I've had some success in that line of work and sort of bringing people together and helping them reach common ground. So I think, guys, that Steven Universe should be required watching for anyone who's going into some kind of like, conflict management type of job or situation where you have to talk to people and get them to come together, because it has a lot of phenomenal lessons to teach.
It's also the type of program that I think would be very beneficial for anyone that's experienced trauma. And what I mean by that is a lot of these characters are extremely flawed characters in different ways. And by flawed, I don't mean that they're bad or they're missing something, but these are people that have in their backstories, they have been through some stuff. Like they have experienced some definite hardships. And this show finds ways of helping these characters resolve their issues in a way that I think is very transferable to the audience. A lot of the things that they're going through are not necessarily very black or white type things. I think we've seen television shows where the theme is I was picked on and now I feel bad about that, so now I need to feel better about it, which is a very viable and valuable message. But I think this show actually takes it a step past that. Some of the things these characters go through are very, very unique to this show, and yet there are a lot of very, very specific correlations to real life things that I've experienced in my life. I know when we talk about episodes a little bit later on, one of the episodes that I flagged to talk about helped me with some trauma I experienced in the last year. And so I'm looking forward to kind of talking about that and sort of how one of the messages in one of the songs like actually ended up being extremely therapeutic to me. And I hear this often too. I don't think that's a unique thing for me. I think that this show is probably one of the best therapies out there.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, the whole like Steven and his mom thing. I lost my mom several years ago, and I can honestly say this show helped me with some of my grief dealing with that. And that's so weird to say that like a Cartoon Network show like helped me like deal with grief. But I think this show has some incredible mechanisms for just kind of helping to get people to like open up a little bit and like talk to each other and sort of find that common ground and relation there that's really helpful in that regard. So Will, I think I know exactly what song you're talking about, but we can definitely talk about that more in our.
Do you mind if I share
episode.
a Facebook comment that someone left on my wall?
Oh yeah,
do it, go for it.
So yeah, my friend Ben Walker replied to my posting of the show. Was like, you changed my life with the show, because I introduced him to it. I've actually encouraged at least one client, he's a social worker, to look it up for therapeutic reasons. The way it addresses themes of identity, abuse, disability, trauma, and recovery are so well crafted and so accessible. I truly feel like it is a healing show. And yeah, this is a kid's show, everybody. So
yeah,
that's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, what other programs can you really think of that you could say this about? Like, I'm racking my brain thinking about other programs that have had this profound an impact on me on kind of an emotional level. And the ones that I think do it are few and far between. I can maybe think of like 2 or 3 kind of tops off the top of my head.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, when you think about the impacts that it has, we've had folks sharing some comments on the Movieverse podcast wall and on my page as well. I made a post about doing this episode, and we may read some of those comments as we get into specific episode discussions, but we're not alone in feeling that way. Chris, your friend, is not alone in feeling that way. And one of the things that's interesting to me is, you know, I put off watching this show for so long because I thought it was going to be dumb. And like, that is a failing of mine. Like, typically the more hype there is, the less I want to like see her do something. But I wish I could go back in time and like give myself advice to start watching this show sooner. But since I can't do that, I just want to advise those of you who may be listening right now who haven't seen it yet, or maybe you thought it was dumb or too silly, to really give it a chance. You might be incredibly surprised by the emotional complexity and depth of this show.
And this is one that, even despite like some of the, like, you know, like we mentioned, some of the earlier episodes are more about being silly, but they're doing so purposefully. Like, I think that you can't just have the characters walk out and immediately like turn into the crying breakfast friends and start like just spilling emotions episode 1, because it wouldn't be earned. Who cares? Who cares if character that you've seen on screen for 30 seconds is going through some stuff? Those first few episodes are designed to be lighter and to establish story, to establish character, and to give us some hooks to these characters before we start going through kind of their issues and before we start kind of moving them forward in the story. So I do say, like, you know, this show is incredibly rewarding. Stay with it. This isn't even one of those ones where the first few episodes are bad. Like, that happens with television shows. The first episodes of this are great. They just don't become as heavy as they do later on in the series, and that's by design.
So let me ask you guys this. How many episodes would you say someone new to the show, and keeping in mind each episode is only like 11 minutes long, how many episodes do you think someone would need to watch in order to like get Steven Universe?
Definitely more than one. I say that because the first episode really puts you in the middle of the action. Like, we start learning a little bit more about some of the characters. I think if you can get to like, and this sounds like a lot, but it's less. If you, by episode 8, you can be kind of hooked. And these are 10, 11-minute episodes. So that's like 4 episodes of a 30-minute comedy or 2 episodes of an hour-long drama. So I would say, and that's the Serious Steven episode where he's gone through a bit of an arc, and now he's trying to, like, you know, I can be someone that's part of the team as well. I think that's a good, like, kind of sink your teeth into it episode. So 8 episodes is what I'd say.
All right. So Will says 8. Chris, how many do you say?
Yeah, I think if you're watching from the beginning, yeah, it might take about 8 episodes to get hooked. And so so in my head, I was kind of tossing around, like, what if I curated some specific episodes to say, hey, you need to watch these in order so you get an idea of the characters. But it's hard to do because they really take their time with the storytelling and kind of like throw in little hooks that get built on and built on and built on. So it's really hard just to like throw someone in and expect them to really feel as much for the characters as someone who's watched them for, you know, months developing these kind of things. But yeah, I'd say that's a good number. So like, yeah, about, you know, 80 minutes in, 90 minutes in, you'll have a good idea of how the show is structured, the emotional hooks that you'll see for these characters, and even in that little bit of time, you'll see them develop and grow, and you can definitely expect a lot more of that.
So in the time span of less than 2 episodes of Game of Thrones, you may find a love for a show that's going to last you years and years and years. I like that. I agree with you guys. I would say, and I want to read a comment from the live chat because it points to kind of my first moment with the show where I started to get it and get on board. Jack Sabbath in the live chat says that Laser Light Cannon episode 2 has a really beautiful moment at the end that got him teary. And Jay, same thing to me. Don't want to go into any kind of spoilers, but I mean, even throughout that episode, there's some things like between Steven and his dad that I was just like, my God, like, is a kid's show really tackling this? Like, really? So I would say, definitely watch beyond the first episode. The first episode is sort of silly setup in a way, but then, like you guys are saying, I think it starts to take its time unpacking from there. So we're gonna go with 8 as an official number. It sounds like so. Give it the Movie Bear Podcast like patented 8 episode try, and would love to hear your thoughts.
And that second episode that you mentioned, that's also the first one that, while Rebecca Sugar is the showrunner, she didn't actually write or storyboard the first episode. The first one that she was directly writing was episode 2. She was just providing direction on the first one. So I think that's why the second episode has a little bit more lore in it than the first one.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, guys, we've had a great discussion about why we love Steven Universe. I think we're only scratching the surface at this point, but it's hard to address some of these topics without spoiling, and we certainly don't want to ruin your potential fun. So we've had our spoiler-free talk. Guys, how do you feel at this point about maybe saying goodbye to those who may want to go check it out without being spoiled and move on? Yeah, to our episode discussion. All right. Sounds good. We can do that. Okay. So then let's just give the warning right now. We're going to be talking about some of our favorite episodes of Steven Universe, why we love those episodes. We're going to be spoiling the hell out of the plots for those episodes. So definitely, if you don't want to be spoiled, and Jay in chat, I see you've only watched half of season 1. You may want to step away, as much as we love having you here with us. If you don't want to be spoiled, maybe come back to this episode after you've had a chance to watch more of the show. But I've awkwardly rambled long enough. Let's go ahead and get things started with our favorite episodes. And Chris, let's go to you first. What's one of yours?
So starting early on, one of the episodes that really kind of hooked me was an episode called Cat Fingers. And as the show progresses, you kind of learn that the gems have different powers, and they do different things because they are aliens from a different world. And one of these abilities is shapeshifting. And so one of the early premises of the show is Steven kind of trying to learn to be a better gem and trying to like activate his powers and trying to figure out what they are. So he sees Amethyst shapeshift, and he's just like, whoa, what's that? And he like tries to do it himself. And after a couple failed attempts, he succeeds kind of, but only on his index finger. And at the tip of his index finger is a little tiny cat head that's meowing and purring and eating and kind of doing its own thing. And he thinks it's the coolest thing in the world. So he goes like running around town and wants to show everybody. And it soon becomes his whole hand. He goes, he orders some fry bits because that's his favorite thing to order at the fry shop. And he puts his fingers in, and the cats all start eating it. But then, like by the end of the second one, he's got like both hands all covered in cats. And so little by little, the episode kind of transforms from this sort of like weird, cute, totally bizarre thing to body horror almost, as he's stumbling around town and is crying out, doesn't know what to do. He's like, oh, I'm a monster. I'm an adorable monster. And to me, that shift in tone was really interesting. And it's not something that you see too often in kids shows, and handled especially well here, I think, was in conjunction with the music. One of the things that we didn't talk about earlier was the music on this show is really amazing.
Yes.
So not even just like the songs, which are great in and of themselves, but I'm a sucker for like super fast drum and bass stuff, and the show loves it. So think of like early Powerpuff Girls intro, that kind of music. They have a lot of that kind of stuff in the background, but they don't just rely on that, because like in this episode, when the horror starts ramping up, the music is very sparse, and they're just like stingers that just happen every now and again, and just really amplify that sort of terror that Steven is feeling. Let me see. So, and in this kind of episode, as I mentioned earlier, like you see a lot of probably anime influences. Like there definitely reminded me of scenes from like Akira, of seeing Tetsuo kind of consumed by all these weird pulsing tumors, which in this case happen to have adorable cat faces on them. As he goes out of control, but eventually he relies on his dad for help. So even though this is a gem-inspired catastrophe, and he's under the care of these heroes, they're actually busy. They're saving the world, and he's got no one to turn to. So he feels he can turn to his dad, and he feels safe and secure enough to go to his dad with this problem. And they figure it out, and it's a happy ending. But to me, that had a lot of like just like cool elements as far as like not being the traditional hero story, and again relying on family bonds and things to really save the day. Did you guys like this episode?
I love that you brought this episode up, Chris, because it's one of my favorites, and it's interesting because this is like what I think episode 4. Something like that, right? It's not very far. Six. Okay, so it's definitely part of like the early stage, right? But one of the things I really loved about this episode, and it ties back to something we were talking about earlier, is it starts off with this very like fun, silly, cute thing, and it's kind of like, all right, if this is the whole episode, like, okay, that's all right, I'll go with it. But it very quickly turns into Steven getting absolutely overwhelmed, and there's this part where he runs to his dad, and he's like laying on the ground, and he's like crying as these cat tumors are like all over him. And he's like, "Dad, help me, please. Like, I'm so scared. I don't know what to do." And I cried, like watching that episode. I'm like, what is this water leaking out of my face? Oh my God, I'm crying about cat tumors? Like, what the hell? And so, that sequence where Steven like drags himself into the car wash, and Greg like hurries up and turns it on, and Steven goes back to normal, and then they hug it out. That was such a great moment, and it happened so early in the series, and I think that's where I really well and truly started to turn around and come on board with this show. So I think that's a phenomenal pick.
It's also great that this episode is the first, and I say first, to introduce like Cronenbergian body horror elements, and I think that's incredibly important because up until now, we've had some fun adventures. We've definitely had some with stakes, but I think this is the first time that those stakes, yes, the stakes before have been kind of like serious, like, oh, the world's in trouble or what have you. This is the first one where it actually felt dark. And I think knowing that like this world that they live in is dangerous and has the potential to cause lasting harm, I think is what makes the struggle that these characters go through so much more engaging. Like if this was just skimming the surface, I feel like we wouldn't have the emotional like connections to these characters that we do. So I think this is the one that sort of sets the tone for, hey guys, there's a whole lot of series to come after this, and some of it's going to get real dark, so get ready.
Yeah, there are some more dark episodes probably on this level eventually, but it's not something that the series really dwells in.
No.
So it definitely isn't afraid to go there, and it isn't afraid to get serious with a lot of its topics and themes, as well as keeping it light and fluffy. So that it manages to sort of balance all of these is kind of incredible, and maybe one of the most endearing things about the show.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Great pick. Let's see. I'll go next. One of my favorite episodes is an episode that revolves around one of my favorite characters in the show, Lion. That is Lion 3, Straight to Video. And of course, Steven is the main thrust of this episode and his relationship with his mom. But basically, the refresher, Will, you've got a little fluffy lion. Let me focus the camera on you. Aww. Nice. And he's being held on your shoulder by your cheeseburger backpack.
Cheeseburger backpack. Yeah.
Woo. But in this episode, basic setup, Steven discovers that by going into Lion's mane, of all things, he can access sort of this pocket dimension that his mom, who was connected to Lion before Steven came to be, stashed away a bunch of stuff. There's like a treasure chest. I still don't think we know what's in that chest, do we?
I don't think we've been in the chest yet.
No, I don't think we have.
We've tried, but we haven't gotten in.
But there's like there's a bunch of stuff there, but he discovers a videotape addressed to him, and he comes back. He ends up watching it with his friend Sadie at the donut store, and it's a message from Rose, his mom, to him. And it's this very sweet message recorded at a beach. You get to see Rose and Greg kind of fooling around a little bit, having some fun. But she basically has this message for Steven that even though she has to give up her physical form for him to come into the world, she's still part of him. She's half of him. And she tells him, every time you love, and I'm getting teary thinking about it, every time you love being who you are, that's her loving who he is. And I mentioned earlier, having lost my mom a few years ago, this show kind of hits me hard sometimes. And this is one of those episodes that did that, and I feel was really helpful for dealing with some of that, because my mom wrote me some letters and stuff before she passed that, thank goodness, I have and I keep and I read sometimes. And it was just so like emotionally resonant and powerful and completely like unexpected for a kid's show to deal with like the grief of like losing your mom. So absolutely one of my favorites. And the silliness with Lion and pulling stuff out of his mane is great, but the emotional heart of it is what did it for me.
Oh, Brad, I just want to give you a big hug. So was this episode the first time that we see Rose Quartz or hear her voice?
I think it's the first time we hear her voice on the video. I think we saw the painting of her above the door previously. Yeah.
But yeah, seeing her as a character was really impressive. Yeah, one of the things we hadn't really talked about was Rose Quartz, and it's just one of those like shows that has this super dark premise where like her, you know, his mom basically gave up her physical form in order to create Steven, which is just, yeah, it's pretty heady. And I thankfully I haven't had to deal with that kind of loss, but I know it's going to happen eventually. And hopefully the show, you know, kind of prepares me for it. But seeing sort of that pocket universe, these kind of like keepsakes and mementos that were special to her, is so intimate. And I just thought that was really cool the first time I saw it. And then rewatching it recently, like I noticed a couple of those things actually come up later. So again, the show kind of feeds you little bits and teases you. Like, so you do see the bubbled bismuth kind of floating there under the tree, which is super cool.
Yeah, that's one of the my favorite parts about rewatching this episode too was this episode is just absolutely dripping with lore, like the types of elements that are important to the long form storytelling that happens here. Just that little island inside of Lion's Mane has so many different things, some of which have come back up and some of which haven't, and you know absolutely will. Like, I'm dying to know what's inside that treasure chest. The other great thing about this one is Rose Quartz is voiced by Susan Egan, who is an absolute delight. You guys probably know her best as she was the voice of Megara in Disney's Hercules movie. So if you watch Hercules, that was her. She also did the one of the leads on Spirited Away. She's an absolute delight. Me and some friends were nerding out over the first time she gets a song in this episode. We're just like, oh my god, she's gonna sing this week, so just if you're a Broadway fan, that's another reason to like this show. She was the first person to play Belle on Broadway's Beauty and the Beast too, so lots of reasons to like this episode and to like the things that it brings up.
The more you know. Da, 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 da.
We can't forget
Well,
about Dog Copter because he's a dog and he's a copter and he shoots missiles out of his butt.
Right? Yes. Like, where does he shoot those rockets from? Oh, yeah.
yeah, so good. And then like he's playing chess with Steven or he's playing checkers in a dream with Steven, but like beats him like by playing a chess move or something. And like Steven's like, Dog Copter, you have to tell me how you did that. Like, I don't know. It was awesome. So good. Well, we could probably keep talking about lots of these episodes forever, but I know we have a lot we want to get to. What was one of your favorites?
So when we first started talking about this, I knew right away there were two episodes that I absolutely had to talk about because to me, when I think about this show, I think they are the sort of the pinnacle of what this show can achieve. And the first one I want to bring up is this episode called Jailbreak. Jailbreak is from a narrative perspective, it is the kind of completion of the first major story arc of this show. In it, Steven has been captured by Jasper and Peridot, who are homeworld gems, and he is on their ship. And this is right after, in the previous episode, Garnet just gets absolutely trounced by Jasper, again, that homeworld gem. So Steven wakes up and he finds this little red gem that he later finds out is named Ruby. And the two of them kind of escape from their prison cells, and they come across this little bitty blue one-eyed gem named Sapphire. And when the two of them meet each other, they run towards each other, embrace, spin. There's a glowing white light, and then we see Garnet. This is the first major big reveal of this show. Garnet has been a fusion this whole time. And for those, we haven't talked about that a whole lot, but fusions are something that's very special to gem mythology. Two gems can form together and create something entirely different. What was so great about this one is all through the first season, there's a bunch of hints as to Garnet's identity as a fusion. The fact that she has two gems, the fact that the door that leads to their little inner sanctums actually lights up with two separate gems when it opens up for her. All of these things like kind of lead towards these clues that you don't really pick up on until the actual reveal happens. But more so than like the kind of just the cool story elements to it are the emotional kind of outpourings that come from that. When Garnet is reunited, when Ruby and Sapphire, the two parts that make her up, are reunited, the first thing we see is Garnet just giving the biggest smile and laughter of joy. And that's something we haven't seen from the normally stoic Garnet up until now. We get to see her in a state of pure joy. Then, as she's now back together and sort of the way that she needs to be, she's able to go face down Jasper and win because she has confidence in herself, and she is, her relationship is stronger. We get to see that through the song "Stronger Than You," which is one of the best songs I think on in the Steven Universe musical pantheon. It also lets us see a little like one of those nuanced relationship things that we were talking about before. Garnet is a character, she's a fusion, but as much as anything, Garnet herself is a relationship. She is a symbol of what balance and love and trust between two individuals that come together, how they come together and they form something stronger than the sum of its parts. We're going to talk probably a little bit more about Garnet because she's got, the Garnet relationship aspects are an important part to some of the story elements. But this was the episode that whenever I talk to friends, I'm always like, text me as soon as you get done with an episode that's titled Jailbreak. Tell me what you thought. And it's always like, it's always OMFG, OMFG, OMFG that I get back. So one of my absolute favorites, I think the pinnacle of what this show can accomplish narratively and emotionally. Do you guys agree?
Big thumbs up for me. I think this was actually the season finale for the first season, which ran like a ridiculously long, like 56 episodes or something crazy for a first season. And this was a really, really amazing climax. I think I listened to Stronger Than You on repeat for like 2 weeks because it was so good.
Yeah, incredible episode. I mean, obviously the song is fantastic, and they officially released the Steven Universe Volume 1 soundtrack back in June, I think, and I've been listening to it a lot, and that's one of my faves. But you're right, Will, and the heart of this episode is really around this idea of Garnet being a fusion. It's kind of interesting. Like, this is really the first time that we kind of get to take a bit of a deep dive into that. And I don't know, it's really interesting to me on the level that you have two obviously female characters, Ruby and Sapphire, not just like, oh, look, we're happy friends that can fuse into one person, but like they love each other. Like there's one point where like Ruby, who's like super tough and like, rah, she's the warrior, she's like crying to be reunited with Sapphire. And Sapphire just kind of takes her, like holds her by the side of the face and like brings her in and like kisses her tears. And then like they glow and like fuse back into Garnet. They're so happy to be together. And I think about like my adult relationships, and certainly like my husband and I can't like fuse together into like one new being. But like, Will, you made the point earlier about being greater than the sum of your parts. And one of the dynamics that I love about my relationship with Jim is like, we're always like riffing off of each other, or through like talking our problems out, we come to, I think, a deeper understanding of some things we probably wouldn't reach if it was just like us by ourselves, if we didn't have that connection. So this idea of like love and fusion being a thing in this show, I think is just such beautiful, like heart speak to me. So great choice.
And there's this one line that I think when I think back to it, it still just kind of wrecks me. Steven didn't know that Garnet was a fusion before this point. And when Garnet is, back together, and the first thing he says is, it's like, oh my God, did I make a good impression? And Garnet's response back is, Steven, we already loved you. And just that right there, just like, I think about that and I'm just like, just a second, guys, I got to this dust out of this room. Like, that is such a powerful way of saying something so strong and so concisely.
Absolutely. Great choice, Will. Chris, how about you? What's your next favorite episode?
So the next one I picked was Jailbreak. And this one was a tough pick for me because it isn't sorry, not Jailbreak, sorry, Keeping It Together.
Okay.
Looking at the wrong line on my notes. Keeping It Together. And it's kind of like in the middle of everything, where like a lot of plot is going on. But one of the things that I do love about this show is the plot and the deep lore and all the stories about the past and what happens to the crystal gems that brought them here today. So it's in the middle of the Peridot arc, where Peridot is kind of loose on Earth, kind of terrorizing the gems, and the gems are trying to catch her wherever they can find her. And that takes them back to the kindergarten, which is where Amethyst was created. Which to me, I've always loved the images of the kindergarten just because it looks so creepy. All these sort of like virus things kind of like digging into the earth and making holes and planting gems. So that return to the kindergarten was fantastic for me. But this is also the first episode where I think it's Garnet is like, okay, crystal gems, we got to go. And Steven is kind of like hanging back, and they're like, no, that means you too. And Steven is super thrilled to be a full-fledged crystal gem at this point. And this is what, 60 episodes in, I believe. So yeah, they take their time with this kind of stuff. So it really means a lot when that happens. And so no big surprise, they find Peridot hanging around at the kindergarten. But Steven actually runs into her first. And another cool thing about this show is it's not like, oh, okay, we found the villain, now we got to fight. Like, Steven's first impulse is not to fight. It's not to run away, but it's to talk to her. Like, he wants to understand what's going on. And that is something very different about this show. And it's pretty funny because he's contrasted with the people who are ostensibly in charge of taking care of him. and they always come in fighting first, which is, you know, it's what they know, which is kind of funny. But it's nice to have Steven as that foil, the emotional heart of the group, essentially. And so, you know, some hijinks ensue, and she flies away. But eventually, they find out what she's been doing, and they go into this like chamber under the earth, and some more elements of I guess kind of body horror happened, because you see like these weird, creepy, like crawling hands and body parts kind of like slithering along the floor, and they find out that those are like gems, actual, you know, probably gems that were part of the rebellion. So they used to have, you know, thousands of members, and there's this huge, you know, battle across the planet, but you've only ever seen, you know, these handful of gems throughout the entire thing. And here they find out that everyone that's been defeated has kind of been turned into these gems and kind of forced together in these forced fusions, that are these horrible creations that weren't meant to be. And this horrifies Garnet to such a point that she starts to split apart like herself, because she just can't deal with all these emotions going on. And that kind of level of just powerful reaction and powerful emotions from these characters. And like you said before, Garnet is usually pretty stoic, so to see her react this way was really shocking. And it's cool to see that kind of character growth and just more aspects of this character. And she kind of goes into why she thinks, or she feels, that forced fusion is just this abomination. It should only be like really coming from a place of love, and to see it perverted in this way is really, really destroying, you know, how she feels about it. And that sort of fusion under, I guess, without consent, is a topic that does come up later, I believe, in a Cry for Help, which is a couple episodes later, where it's gone into fusing with her to solve an issue, and that causes a major sort of fissure between them for a while. And this kind of fusion being the heart of the expression of love between gems or between people is fascinating, and I think it's something unique to the show, and this really highlighted why that was so important to it.
Yeah, Chris, phenomenal pick here. I was just watching this episode again today, because I know we were kind of like sharing lists a little bit so we could kind of refresh ourselves on some of these episodes. And one thing that really got to me this time through that I didn't think impacted me as much the first time was sort of what happens after Garnet like starts to split apart. Steven, who's not like a super great fighter at this point, right? He's like in the background. He's like supporting Garnet and like reminding her like why she's amazing. And what happens when like Ruby and Sapphire like sort of re-engage their love for each other, like Garnet comes right back together and she stays strong and she's able to defeat the enemy. And even though she's dealing with all of this craziness going on, when she focuses on the love that holds Ruby and Sapphire together, that's when she's strongest. And that's a message that she gives on to Steven as well. And I think that's incredibly powerful, again, for a kid's show to tackle like that.
Yeah, I think that's what's so cool about this particular episode is it actually pulls two of the elements that we've talked about in previous episodes that we liked into sort of into the forefront. This is a very dark episode because it does deal with this forced fusion. I mean, as close as anything, I mean, this is an analog to rape in some ways, and that's very uncomfortable territory, obviously, especially to focus on in a children's show. But past that, it also focuses on that bond between Ruby and Sapphire that is Garnet. This is the first time we've actually seen that something rock their relationship. Up until now, Garnet has been pretty stoic. Even when she's been split, it's been because of external forces, and she just can't wait to get back together. So just this stuff creeping into her brain because of just how traumatic seeing these gem clusters pushed together is. I think I think that makes it even more jarring to me as an audience member, because whenever you see Garnet lose her cool, it means something major is happening. This is the character who lives and breathes cool. So you know when she's in when she's not doing well, you're supposed to sit up and pay attention.
Indeed, absolutely. Great point, Will. And Chris, phenomenal pick once again. Just moving along, it always seems like we have so much time when we start, that we get into the conversations like, oh my God, we're almost done with our time. But we still have a lot of episodes to talk through. So I'm going to go a little brief on some of my picks here, just to kind of make sure we can get through them all. My next one here is an episode called Same Old World, and it deals with a character named Lapis Lazuli. And Lapis spent thousands of years trapped in her cracked gem attached to the back of a mirror. So she's sort of like a consciousness in a mirror. And then later on, Steven like heals her gem. She reconstitutes. She becomes part of the story. And there's this enemy named Jasper. And Lapis and Jasper end up fusing in Jailbreak, I believe, into this bigger form. And Lapis basically takes control of the fusion, traps them both under the sea for a protracted period of time until that can be resolved later on. Anyway, Same Old World really picks up after all of that has been said and done and dealt with. Lapis is living, temporarily in the barn, and she basically decides, Steven comes to visit, and she decides that she wants to leave Earth. After being a prisoner for so long, she just wants to get away from Earth and go. And so Steven kind of says a tearfelt goodbye, and lo and behold, Lapis comes back. Because she can't go back to Homeworld. She is an enemy there. She has nowhere to go. She doesn't know what to do. And so Steven convinces her to go on a tour of him with some of the different places on Earth and kind of, discover Earth sort of on her own terms. And so they visit places like Empire City, which we really haven't seen much outside of Beach City or space at this point. So it was cool to see other areas on the planet. But through this journey, Lapis kind of discovers the joy of living on Earth, and she decides on her own that she wants to stay. And I think it's such an incredibly powerful message, because I don't know about you guys, but I have friends that are always depressively complaining on Facebook about how terrible life is in their area, how they can't find anybody to love in their area, how there are no good jobs in their area, how they have no friends in their area, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And for me, this episode is kind of an allegory for sometimes, in order to, get past some of those things, you have to stop letting life happen to you, and you have to start making life happen. And so this metaphor of Lapis, choosing to stay, choosing to embrace humanity, choosing to explore what it has to offer, I think is an exceptional message for kids, because it's everybody doesn't get a trophy, and everybody doesn't get their heart's wishes and desires fulfilled just by showing up and being alive. You might actually have to get out of where you grew up, do some exploring, and put yourself out there to get the things you want in life. So for me, very powerful episode. What did you guys think of that one?
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is an incredibly powerful episode for that very reason. I think that it's up until now, the character of Lapis hasn't had a lot of agency, in that a lot of the choices that she's had to make have been forced upon her. She was trapped in this mirror, and then she was held captive, and then she felt like the only way that she could break free of that was to pull Jasper underwater and just do all of that. There was a long arc with Lapis sort of being pulled around by the story, and this is the first scene or the first time where we get to see this character with the ability to make a decision of her own. And that decision at first is, I got to get out of here. I got to do something else. I can't be here. And through the healing powers of Steven and his ability to kind of talk through situations, she identifies the fact that while she's been on Earth for a while, she hasn't actually experienced it. And now she's going to make the decision on what she experiences and how. And I think there's something very powerful about that. Whether you love the area you're in or not, whether you're happy with your life circumstances or not, being able to have the agency and the say-so in order to improve or find contentment within those circumstances is incredibly powerful. I love that we got to see that here through Lapis, who, in addition to everything else, is just a really cool support character, and one that I'm glad we've got to have some more proximity to the gym so she can pop up more and more and more in future stories.
Yeah, and I think the way that they handle Lapis's trauma is very delicate as well. Like, Garnet sees her and she's like, whoa, she's pretty messed up after all of this. It's going to take a long time for her to heal. So they kind of recognize that, and they don't force kind of these choices on her. And that agency of Lapis to actually make these decisions is super important. When she wants to leave, Steven isn't like, oh, but wait, you haven't seen this, or oh, have you tried this? He's not really trying to fix her at that point. He's like, you need to leave. That's cool. Do it for yourself. And that's going to be your healing journey. And I think that's really important to kind of realize that although, you know, going out and getting to see everything may help things and may help you see, you know, your problems from a different perspective, you have to come to that realization yourself, and no one can really force that on you or say, hey, you're ready to do this if you're not ready to do that. So I think that's just one of those really sort of delicate threading the needles, like, oh man, this is like too serious for this kind of show, but like they handled it really well. And I was impressed.
Hey, at least they threw in some Jersey jokes to balance out some of the deep stuff here. That's just Jersey. People are mean over there.
And we got to see Empire City for the first time too, which is sort of the analog for New York. I think that's something I'm looking forward to talking about here in a moment.
I know exactly where that's going to come up well. I think we have a shared point of interest coming up. But Will, let's set that aside for a moment and just go ahead and go into your next pick. What do you got?
So one of the things that I love so much about this show that we haven't had a chance to talk a whole lot about here is the human cast, the citizens of Beach City. We've talked about Greg Universe, the father, but there is a very robust cast of humans that are friends with, are protected by Steven, and some of my absolute favorite characters on the show, Lars and Sadie, for example, are amongst that cast. But chief amongst them is a character named Connie, who is Steven's best friend slash romantic interest slash the first person that he has ever fused with. And in one of my favorite episodes, one called Sworn to the Sword, we find out a few things. After demonstrating some light combat prowess, Steven catches the idea, hey, Connie should learn to sword fight with Pearl. Pearl is a great teacher of swordsmanship. Connie has some prowess. So now Connie has Rose's sword, which she's used once before in a previous episode, and begins training to be Steven's knight. This is an incredibly powerful moment for me because I think the idea of someone willing to, as one of the lines in the song that they sing in this, willing to die to protect someone else, I think that's incredibly powerful. But as much as that, I think that this show takes it to the next level. I think that would have been a compelling story in and of itself. But Steven starts to recognize as well that both Pearl and Connie have sacrificed too much of themselves into this role of knight and protector, and doing so would make them recklessly throw their lives away for their person they're protecting. And by the episode's resolution, Steven and Connie learn that they can fight together and become even more powerful than if they were fighting by themselves. Connie with the sword, Steven with the shield, and in later episodes, them fused with the sword and shield combined. One of probably my favorite gym, if I really think about it, is Pearl, because of her story arc, because of the relationship she had with Rose Quartz in her past, the fact that she still hung up on that so heavily, having to deal with the fact that you're absolutely you shared this love for someone that is no longer here. That is an incredibly difficult and trying thing to try to process, and we get to see Pearl starting to do that. We get to see Connie emerge as a badass And we get to see one of the best. Again, there's a lot of the ones I picked are partially because of the music. This one has an absolutely fantastic song where Pearl and Connie learn to sword fight together. So, a super solid episode. Are you guys on board with this pick?
Oh my gosh, the depth of emotion that Pearl goes through in this episode is mind-blowing. It's funny to hear you say that Pearl is like one of your favorite characters, because if you just start this show, she seems pretty one-dimensional, this kind of like Miss Perfect, everything has to be orderly and right, and just kind of annoying. I've heard her described as once they start, but they introduce these aspects to her character, including just this unending well of devotion to Rose Quartz that she had, and their really intimate, special relationship that they shared while she was on Earth, and becoming this knight, this defender of Rose Quartz, and that puts her in such a different light that you can't help but sort of just feel this empathy for her and at what she's lost. So yeah, these elements just really took me by surprise in this episode, because they come out of these wells of emotion. And again, it's not just this one episode. They get revisited and they explain this more in later episodes, and you understand at that point why she feels these ways towards some of the other characters, and how that affects their relationships. So yeah, thumbs way up. That song was really good too. I liked it a lot.
Absolutely. And Pearl is a phenomenal character. I think we're going to get a little deeper into Pearl here in just a little bit. Wink, wink. But, Will, you mentioned the human characters. One of the things I really liked was sort of Pearl's mentorship of Connie at first. But then it takes sort of this disturbing turn where I think Pearl is like channeling her own like grief over Rose into the Connie-Steven relationship. And she's like, Connie, you've got to be Steven's knight. Like, he is your liege. Like, your life means nothing. Give up your life for his. He is everything. You are nothing. And she's like, I'm nothing, Steven. You are everything. And I'm just like, whoa, what is this show like trying to do? Like, are they telling girls they need to like see guys as their lieges? But like Steven comes in and he's like, no, like, you're not nothing. Like, you are amazing and you're awesome in your own right. But like, let's be amazing and awesome together. Let's be jam buds. And I thought that was so cute. Like, the way that they handled that, and the way that Connie really gets to come up, and even though she's not a magical, like, gem powered person, maybe she's kind of the I don't know, the Batman to this universe a little bit, in a way. She, in a lot of ways, as future episodes unfold, is even more effective than Steven in some ways. And she's not a magical alien. So I think this does a really good job of kind of starting to set that up and plant some of those seeds, which is awesome. Great pick, Will. Definitely. All right, so guys, we're moving into our final round of picks. Let's go to Chris. Chris, what was the last episode you selected for your favorites?
The title of this episode is called The Answer. But before I get into that, I'll do one throwback to the end of Jailbreak, kind of as a throwaway line as the star wipe is starting. Garnet's kind of like, oh, I wanted to tell him for his birthday about her being a fusion. And this episode opens up and it's Steven's birthday. But he already knows that Garnet's a fusion, so she has something else in store. And she decides to go into the backstory of how Ruby and Sapphire first met and first became Garnet. So it starts off with a really cool flashback scene where we get to see the original two crystal gems, which are going to be Pearl and Rose Quartz, in action. And they're kind of kicking all sorts of butt, and it's pretty neat. And you see, for the first time, I believe, a fusion of similar gem types. And so a lot of the smaller gems back on Homeworld would be used kind of as fodder, or if they needed to be stronger, they would fuse a whole bunch of them together and they would become these bigger versions of essentially themselves. And I believe it's Rose Quartz that comes in and kind of like busts up this huge ruby, and they're about to pounce on Sapphire, and one of the rubies was feeling sort of something for Sapphire, but she didn't really know it yet, and interrupts the future vision that Sapphire had already predicted and resigned herself to, stops the attack, and they wind up fusing together and forming Garnet's first appearance. And it's pretty interesting the way that she's portrayed the first time around, because it's very messy. This her hair is like all sorts of different colors. She's wearing like one shoe, and things are kind of weird, but it's messy, but they're experiencing this new sensation of being this different person, this fused being that's never been done before. And everyone on Homeworld is horrified and disgusted, and they think this isn't natural. So in addition to the layers of these female presenting non-gendered aliens, I guess, in this sort of loving relationship that they get into, they also have to face the stigma of the rest of the culture telling them that what they're doing isn't right and it's horrible, and so they flee and they run into the jungle, and eventually are discovered by Rose Quartz and Pearl once again, and that's how she became part of the Crystal Gems. And so they have a really good song in this one too, and it kind of ends with Steven asking all sorts of questions about like how did this come to be? How did Ruby decide that this was the right time to act, and all these things? And at the end, she says that that Garnet already is the answer, and that answer is love. And it's again one of those overarching themes throughout all these episodes. Love is super powerful, and it's something worth saving and worth fighting for.
It's amazing that we can get something like this out of a children's program, right? Like, this is the type of story and message that you don't get very many places. I think about like that relationship between Ruby and Sapphire, these two characters who, depending on how you see the gems, this is either a lesbian relationship if you look at them as female, or it's a non-traditional, non-binary genderqueer relationship if you look at them as female presenting but not quite female. Either way, this is not a heterosexual as we know it relationship, and it is given respect, and it has given patience, and it is given way more of a delicate handling than any relationship of that type that I've ever seen on television. And it's geared towards children who are their next generation, right? Like, these are the people who are at some point or another going to have to carry the torch forward and make this world a better place. I have a nephew who is, he's going into high school very soon, but a few years ago, probably when he was like 9 years old or so, one of his best friends came out as transgender. And it was such an easy, like, I was prepared, like, all right, okay, I'm going to have to gay uncle this one and kind of talk him through it. And so he's like, no, he's a boy. And that's what it is. It was a female who transitioned to male. And he just said, just was able to flip the switch and say, he is male now. And that is how I see him. And that's how he is. And that's how I will treat him. Gives me so much hope for the future, and seeing shows like this that are able to have this type of a message for children gives me so much hope for the future, especially in light of just the current climate and everything.
Yeah, it's a pretty phenomenal message overall. And this is another one of those where, the music just serves so well to sort of encapsulate like the main point. Like some of the lyrics of the song that they use are something not quite me, something not quite you, something entirely new. And it's such a catchy song. Like, it just sort of reverberates through your head. But I think it says so much, not just about, like non-stereotypical heterosexual relationships, but also just like relationships with people in general. I think as people, a lot of times we isolate ourselves a lot by not opening up with each other, not allowing ourselves to form deep connections because we're afraid of how people might think of us or what they might say if they get to know us. And I think it's this really incredible message of like, if you do open yourself up to someone and they open themselves up to you and you start sharing all these things about yourself back and forth, whether they end up becoming your wife, your husband, your best friend, whoever it is, you end up creating something that is so much more powerful than if you were just sort of going through life by yourself. So I think it's sort of this like double swing, like pincer arm move that really helps to kind of encapsulate all of those things in a very powerful way for kids who are now growing up, having learned these life lessons from a Cartoon Network show. Gives me hope too that maybe 20 years from now the world is going to be much better as a result of Steven Universe than it would have been without it. So definitely a great pick.
These kids are going to grow up who watch this episode. Kids who watch this episode and are able to go, yeah, I love Garnet as a relationship, and I love Ruby and Sapphire as characters, and I love these characters so much. It's cool that they're kids right now. They're going to be voters in a few years.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Definitely a great point and a very timely one. So we've got one pick left. Will, you and I have it in common. If you don't mind, why don't you go ahead and set it up, give your thoughts, and then, of course, I'll chime in as well. But what is our last pick, Will?
Yeah, this is my favorite episode of Steven Universe. I mentioned Jailbreak before as one of the two that were musts for this list, but Mr. Greg is my absolute favorite episode. So the premise to this one is kind of silly when you think about it. Of the different ones, it's got one of the silliest startups you could possibly imagine. At the very beginning of the episode, Greg, which is Steven's dad, he gets a very, very, very big paycheck because of a song that he wrote, which appeared in a previous episode, has now been adapted into a fast food jingle. So now he's just got money, like so much money. And this is a guy that lived in a van and ran a car wash before this. So he and Steven start figuring out, like, what are we going to do? Maybe we can save up and buy this. No, I don't really need that. Maybe I can send you off to college. No, that's not really going to work. I'm kind of a magic superhero character. Okay. Well, why don't we go on a trip? And they decide, yes, let's go on the trip. And they're going to go to Empire City, which we mentioned earlier, which is the New York City analog. And Steven decides that they need to bring Pearl along. And the reason for this is Steven has recognized that Greg and Pearl don't really connect very well. Of all the different like people in his life, these are two characters that are usually on opposite ends from one another. And it's because they were both rivals at one point for Rose Quartz's love. Pearl was her knight. Greg was this kind of free-floating guy that kind of bopped into the life, and to Pearl, scooped up Rose out from under her. And so there's resentment. So through the course of the episode, they spend some money here, they spend some money there, but most importantly, we have a chance for Pearl to express via song sort of the realization that all these things that she's been harboring aren't really for anything anymore. Her relationship with Rose is over. Rose is over itself, and she's not really sure how she's going to move on. Steven recognizes that these two people are grieving in the exact same way and is able to get Greg and Pearl to talk to one another, to kind of commiserate with one another. And by the end of the episode, they have this connection. Like, these are two people that probably needed each other more than just about anyone else on this cast. And they were ignoring one another because of their own tensions and their own pressures. The reason this one is so incredibly important to me is that I think that the idea of having a partner that you were with for a long time and is no longer here is something I personally resonate with as someone who spent 8 years married to someone and who, though we separated, it hit me ridiculously hard when he died, like less than a year ago. And my grieving process was not an easy one, nor was it one that I think is completely over. And especially so considering this is a person from, before we separated, it was a different town, a different area. So everyone in my life here in Austin doesn't know about this connection, or doesn't know about this sort of important integral part of 8 years of my life, a quarter of my life. So my own grieving process was ridiculously similar to Pearl's, just sort of internalized and isolated, and trying to kind of sort through all of these messy things without having that kind of that shoulder to cry on, or that person to commiserate with. And so that's why this, I think, is my favorite episode. Not only is it got some of the greatest songs, and that's that thing that comes up on all these episodes I bring up. The music is such an important part of the show. Not only does it have some great closure for both Greg and Pearl's arcs, which have been going on for, probably I think 80 or 90 episodes at this point before we get to this one. But of all the different ones, it's the most personally therapeutic to me.
Yeah, well, this is, I mentioned this is one of my picks too, and I think you articulated very well why. For me, having lost my mom, as well as other trauma that happens in life, my usual response to that sort of thing is just to kind of isolate myself and sort of shut down and just deal with things internally. And one of the great things about this episode was just sort of this message that grief that is shared and processed together is much more therapeutic. That's a good word. Than sort of trying to internalize and deal with it on your own. And for me personally, I have family members that I had not been close to prior to my mom passing. And after she did pass, not necessarily because of this episode, I saw it later, but I kind of came to a realization through watching a show called 6 Feet Under on HBO. I don't know if you guys have seen that at all. That grief needs to be shared. That is the grieving process. Human beings are social creatures. And so I reconnected with those family members. And even though we had differences, we hashed them out and we talked. And, mom passing was kind of a weird catalyst for knitting the family back together in a way. And I just think that message of grief being shared is so incredibly powerful in its own right. But seeing it in a kid's cartoon like this, and I know we keep saying that, but seeing it in a kid's show like this, I think about these kids who are growing up learning this from 5 years old and on, as opposed to adults who are spending thousands of dollars on therapy right now, probably trying to learn the same lesson. I think it's incredible. I really do.
Yeah, one of the key points of this is just delving deeper into Pearl's just attachment to Rose Quartz, and they probably spent thousands of years together. So I can only imagine what kind of relationship people have after that amount of time. And the really, really great thing about this was kind of Steven engineering his dad and Pearl to be in the space at the same time, specifically so they could work this out, and realize that they did have a bond with Rose Quartz, but they do currently have a bond with Steven, and loving Steven is enough to bring them together. So yeah, it's really great. And yeah, everyone was all gaga about that song for such a long time. I think it really hit a lot of people's heartstrings. And yeah, I think this is a fantastic episode to close the show on.
The timeliness of it for me personally was so good, because this episode aired in July, and I have this weird tendency to, with Steven Universe, other shows, you watch them on the DVR, you watch them, you delete them, right? You free up room for the next one. But I tend to stockpile Steven Universes, and I don't know why, because I have them all on Amazon. That's where I purchased the streaming for them, right? But I end up a new episode will come out, and I'll just sit there and I'll have 10 or 12 of them backed up, and then I'll finally go, okay, well, I've got them saved elsewhere. I can delete these off of here. So it was only 3 months later when John died, and so this one was still on my DVR at that point. And I think that was just wonderful time, like just like a very fortuitous that I could go back and sort of revisit this and revisit another episode that we didn't talk about here, that both were, you know, just so timely. Like, I mean, it would have been helpful if I'd seen these episodes a year before or 2 years before, but the fact that they were so fresh and I still had such immediate access to them was, you know, such a godsend.
Absolutely. And Will, I'm so glad that this show has been such a positive force for you in that way. I can definitely see that. And you know, really for everybody that is watching this show, having that effect, I think is amazing. We have a question in the live chat that I want to get to, and then I want to read a couple listener comments. But Ryan Rivera says, I prefer listening to It's Over at about 0.75 speed. I think some emotional songs sound better slightly slowed. He wants to know what we think. Chris, what's your thought on this idea of slowing it down?
So I've heard various songs slowed down, but I haven't heard this one yet. So I'm curious to try it. I think it has definitely a very different effect. So yeah, I think I'll be doing that as soon as we log off here.
How about you, Will?
I haven't listened to it at a 3/4 speed before. So I don't know how it compares. I love the song, but I think that it's the type of one that would work at a slower speed. So yeah, this is what I'm right there with you, Chris. Like, as soon as we get done, I'm going to go give that a whirl and just see how it sounds.
Yeah, me too. I'm interested to check that out. I haven't actually thought about doing that before, so I kind of love, Ryan, that you're giving us a new idea. So thank you for that. Just a couple listener comments here. Let's take a look. One of my favorite names in the universe, Ron Sequitur, mentions Stevani, and that isn't something we've really talked about. Steven fusing with Connie, his human companion friend, and sort of the message of like gender identity and like fusing personalities being very interesting. Ron says he loves that Stevani doesn't have a clear gender because, as Garnet puts it, Stevani is an experience. Ron says he's literally used examples like this in therapy with his clients before, and to see it presented in an easily digestible way in this show sort of makes him giddy. So that's kind of awesome. Real life therapist using Steven Universe in therapy sessions. That's pretty great, I think. So awesome, Ron. Thanks for giving us some thoughts. Jeff, our friend Jeff, says that his favorite episode is Mr. Greg. So, well, there you go. Other people showing some love for this episode as well. He says that one episode captures both the epic music, both of you, as well as the slow burn, challenging emotional arc that the show so often hits. We've got some other comments here as well. A bunch of people wrote in expressing their love for Steven Universe. We don't have time to go through all of them, unfortunately, but it has been great hanging out with you guys. Those of you who are listening live right now, we're so glad that you joined us. Those of you who are maybe listening on digital tape delay, we're glad to have you guys with us as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts about Steven Universe as well. Let's let the discussion continue. We may even do more of these episodes in the future. I don't know. We'll see how it plays. If you guys like it, maybe we'll revisit some other episodes and review them. But before we wrap, one thing I wanted to do, Will, we were chatting earlier, and you put a link to a BuzzFeed Steven Universe quiz in the chat. You had us take it. Tell us a little bit about this quiz. Why did you have us take it?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's so fascinating about the Crystal Gem universe is that there's this very, very specific caste system that comes with each of the gems. If you are a ruby, your personality is such and your role in society is such. If you're a sapphire, it's this. If you're a diamond, or if you're a quartz, you know, you have these things that are very specific to you. And whenever you have something like that, you know, personality traits tied to something, it makes identifying which gem would you be most like a lot more easy and a lot more fun, because you can find things that line up with you, or maybe that are a little separate from you and such. So I looked through a few different quizzes online just because there's quizzes. You know, you can't shake a cookie cat without hitting a quiz or 18 online. But I found one in particular that had instead of it just tying to a specific character, it actually tied to a specific gem type, and I thought that would be a little more fitting for what we're doing. So that's the quiz we all took, and I think our results were pretty interesting. Should I go first? You
Yeah,
want to
go
go?
for
Yeah.
it. What
Yeah.
what did you get, Will?
I got, and I don't know if I necessarily like if it would be the one that I think lines up most with me, but what I got was quartz. I'm strong and loyal, and the first person to step up if anyone messes with your crew. Though you might come across as a little intimidating, you're a big softy at heart. So that's like amethyst, or that's like rose quartz. That's there's a few different quartzes within this particular universe. I think there's probably a few that are maybe a little closer to me, but I'm cool with this one. It's always fun to be said that you're a strong, big softy.
I see that fitting for you, Will, in a lot of ways. I'm not surprised that you got that result. So definitely interesting that a quiz pegged that. It's interesting though. The first question of the quiz is like, what weapon would you choose? And it's like, here's a whip, here's a sword, here's a shield, and I'm like, I bet you if I pick the whip, it's going to tell me I'm amethyst and the other questions don't matter. But surprisingly for BuzzFeed, that was not the case. I did a test run through to see if I could specifically get like a pearl result, and I did not. So then I took it for real and got my result. But Chris, I want to hear about your experience taking this test and what your result was and what you think.
So I took the test and answered it as honestly as I could with the limited questions that you have and the responses available, and was a little surprised at the result. But then I chewed on it for a little bit. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. So I got a Peridot. I'm a technical whiz with excellent tinkering skills. I unceasingly pursue the things that you want, and though you can be a little bit stubborn, maybe a little bit, you keep an open mind and heart for the people you care about. And that definitely encapsulates like the technical side of my brain, because I can definitely relate with Peridot as far as relating to other people and being headstrong, but ultimately, as she did in the show, she really fought for what she believed was right, which didn't necessarily line up with what everyone thought necessarily, but she did see the light, and like I really wound up liking Peridot as a character, so I'm okay with this choice.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely seems fitting for you as well, Chris. I know you have that like tech whiz thing going on, but you also have a really interesting way of sort of like looking at problems and solving them. Things that maybe are apparent to you don't necessarily stand out to others. So when you mentioned the result that you got, I'm kind of like, okay. I can see that. All right, let's run with that. My result, I don't know. I had mixed feelings about the result I got was a diamond. So the description, according to the quiz, you're exceedingly rare with an awe-inspiring power. You have a large presence that inspires others to constantly look to you for leadership and guidance. So my first thought was every diamond we've seen is like evil and selfish and tyrannical. And I'm like, I'm not sure I'm happy with that result. But Will, you mentioned it doesn't say you're an evil diamond. It just says you're a diamond. So I think about like my job and some of the social roles that I take with like our local bear club and stuff. I guess I can see the leadership aspect to that. But I don't know how picking like rock music as one of the questions maybe fits into being a diamond. I don't know.
I picked rock music too, so it's interesting about that. I think the one issue I have with diamond for you is only because I think the two diamonds that we've seen so far have two very different personality types, so their only commonality is just cased. So I think that whereas the others, we know what a personality type of a pearl is supposed to be like, both from the ones that we've seen and the one that is different. We've seen what the quartzes act like, but the two diamonds that we've seen are very different personalities, and that's why I think it was a weird one for this test. I sort of fan cast us. I Brad, you're like the tech guy that when I think about like just like people complaining on like, oh, this isn't working on my my Apple thing, you know, you're the first one to be able to say like, have you tried this or check this out? So I totally saw you as like a kind of a homeworld Peridot, not our Peridot, but like a homeworld Peridot who has a little bit more of that authority, but also is sort of like tech person. I fan cast Chris as a bismuth because their job, they are the creators, they are the crafters, the builders, and I think of like Chris's webcomic and just the creative things that he does, and I think from there. And I am a worrywart who is constantly worried about like, you know, the future and what's going to happen, and probably get too bogged down in that. So I pushed myself as a sapphire just because, you know, they have future vision. I'm constantly like, either I'm an over planner. I am way much an over planner. So I think what's so cool about these is you can find little cool. I bet you like if each of us fan cast it, we'd probably come up with different results, and that's fine because we're able to see different aspects of ourselves and different aspects of each other's in these characters. And no matter which way it goes, holy crap, it's infinitely fun, right?
Absolutely. Typically with these internet quizzes, I'm just like, oh God, really? Like, you know, but this one was interesting. So, Will, I'm glad you threw it into the chat so we could kind of take it and talk about it a little bit here. Guys, I can't believe we've been talking about Steven Universe for like 2 hours at this point.
I can.
Yeah. And I feel like there's so much more that we could be saying. We just unfortunately are running way past the end of our allotted time together. But who knows? Maybe if this resonates, we'll come back and revisit Steven Universe soon.
And in fact, if this does, if you're listening to this episode right now on YouTube or on iTunes or anything like that, if you've stumbled upon this episode, we've done this as sort of like a one-shot. We were talking this week about how much we loved Steven Universe and said, hey, let's just get together and talk about Steven Universe. But if this is the type of thing that you want more of, if you would like for us to have something that's a little more regular or semi-regular or something like that, pop over to our Facebook page, Movie Bears Podcast, and leave us a comment that says, hey, I want more of this. You know, we're trying to meet kind of the demands of the people, so to speak. So if this is something you like, let us know. If it's not, you know, you don't have to let us know that. That's fine. But if you want more, let us know.
Oh, goodness. Indeed. And hey, we just got a message from Robert, who's here with us in the live chat. Hey, Robert, glad you could join us. I know we're getting ready to end here, but glad you're here. Ryan Rivera says, damn, missed my chance to explain my diamond authority theory. Well, Ryan, you haven't missed your chance. Leave us that comment on Facebook, as Will suggested. We want to hear your theory. Maybe we can even talk about it if we do another episode like this coming up. So definitely get that in there. Guys, before we do our final, that's it. We're done. Will, where can people interact with you online if they want to chat about Steven Universe or anything else?
Absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at Whatever Cove. That's where I share my GIFs and memes of Steven Universe. You can find me on Facebook. Just look for William Lindis. That's where I'm checking into the episodes that I watch and then posting like 18 exclamation marks when something amazing happens. And you can find me on Letterboxd, which is where we go to review movies. And that's William Lindis as well.
All right. Awesome. And sexy voice of the Movie Bears Podcast, Chris Lopez, where can people find you?
Again, you can check the Facebook page, the Movie Bears, on there, and I'll be commenting as Chris Lopez. Additionally, you can see the webcomic that Will referenced at signalandsilence.tumblr.com. So I'm glad we were able to get together and do this. They really haven't announced the next episodes yet, so this is kind of like getting my Steven Universe fix going, so to help us last.
Yeah, so ostensibly there's supposed to be a new episode after Comic-Con, and I went and searched for this when we were talking about Lion earlier. SDCC has a 15-inch Lion plushie that you can pre-order. What? I pre-ordered it. I had to. Awesome. I sleep with a 13-inch plush Appa from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Appa, I have loved sleeping with you the last couple of years, but I think Lion is going to replace you, at least for a little while. That's Appa, fair.
Yep.
Why not both?
Right? Exactly.
Right? Yeah. I co-sign this plan.
Sorry, Jim. There's no room for you.
You guys can find me on Twitter. My handle is on screen below if you are watching via YouTube. But if you're listening via audio only, find me on Twitter at iBradPro. You can also find me on Facebook. Just search for Brad Harris. I'm the one that probably has Bear, Chubb, or Chaser friends in common with you. So feel free to add me, but do me a favor, send me a message if you add me, just so I know you're from the podcast and not some strange, like, random robot. Ryan says, I have the giant plush Bolt dog that I love. Ryan, that's a great idea, too. Such a fun movie. And if it's really that giant, that's got to be pretty awesome. So good stuff. All of you hanging out with us live, thanks so much for being here with us tonight. It was nice hanging out with you guys and hearing from you. Those of you who commented on Facebook, thank you so much for writing in. We appreciate that. We'll see you all next time on the Movie Reviews Podcast. Good night, everybody. See you later.
Goodbye.
Good night. Bye.